Chapter 24. Ken sat on a stool in his grandparents' home, staring into the steaming cup of honeyed green tea. Leaning his elbows on the L-shaped counter, he tried to focus on what Baba, his granny, was saying, but his heart ached so bad he could only concentrate on breathing. Betty was supposed to meet them today. She should have been sitting next to him, meeting two of the most important people in his life. Ryota had nurtured the shifter part in Ken, but his Baba and Gigi had helped develop his soul. Ken had spent much of his short childhood in this little house. Delicate, dry fingers wrapped his with a squeeze. He met the dark, wrinkled gaze filled with concern. Baba's sad smile eased a little of his pain. No matter what, he'd never lose her love. She's your soulmate, Kennekin. She'll forgive you. He lifted and kissed her hand. She'd been chopping ginger for soup and smelled wonderful. Have you ever heard of soulmates staying apart? Betty refused to answer his calls and texts. Her lips thinned. You're a good boy. She patted his cheek. That won't happen to you. He shook his head and rose to his feet. I'm going over to her place. Make her listen. Using her shifter strength, Baba kept hold on his finger. Tomorrow. But tomorrow. Listen to an old woman who's had more than her fair share of arguments. Let your mate be furious for one night. When you see her tomorrow, she will be less likely to kill you. Baba pointed to his chair. Then you can grovel for her forgiveness. Sit, eat, stay the night. Grovel, huh? Are you saying it wasn't your fault? She released his finger and went back to cooking. No, it was all his fault. He should have said something sooner, but he'd never claimed to be perfect. The whole soulmate thing had his head spinning. Bring her something tasty to eat. How could he ignore such sage advice from his petite Baba? She was wise, and he had heard that his grandparents' spats had been legendary. Ryota had told Ken that she'd even tossed their car at his Gigi's head once. The kitchen door swung open and Gigi, his grandpa, sauntered inside. He halted and eyed Ken's cup. Tea. Gigi knew all the details of how Betty had dumped Ken. Want some? Ken lifted the small cup. Gigi was an older version of Ryota, with white hair that hung down his back. His head only reached Ken's shoulder, but he still treated Ken like a pup. Heck, he treated the alpha like one too. It was nice sometimes to come here and let them dote. Ken had wanted to share this special place with Betty, introduce her to the people who had accepted a scruffy, orphan shifter boy into their lives as if he was their full-blooded grandson. With a shake of his head, Gigi joined him at the counter. Herbs grew on shelves in the window and the delicate scents filled the room. Stainless steel met antique cabinets. Ryota had offered to buy them a new home in Ken's neighborhood, but they loved their odd little house in the city. Every scrap of land in their small yard was used for gardening. Urban farmers, Ken called them. Baba set some freshly steamed dumplings on a tray. Your father is on his way. You can snack on these while we wait for him. She took the ginger to her soup pot. Once she was at the stove, Gigi moved with his shifter speed and set a tall glass in front of him. He pulled a mason jar filled with clear liquid from under the sink and filled Ken's glass to the brim. Kennekin, you need something stronger to drink than tea. Sake isn't strong enough. Shifters processed alcohol quickly. Might as well drink This isn't sake. Gigi took a sip and grimaced. It's full moonshine. Ken sat up straighter and stared at his full glass. Where did you get it? He whispered. Full moonshine wasn't legal since humans could go blind if they accidentally drank the stuff. Baba turned a frown on them. Your father won't approve. Oh, let the boy be a man. Gigi kissed Baba tenderly. He's heartbroken. You only want someone to drink with you. She swatted her husband on the butt. Ken's heart broke even more. He had wanted this with Betty. Have a family. Grandchildren. Spoil them rotten. Slip them full moonshine when they were dumped. The first sip tasted like pure paint remover with a touch of fennel. Ken coughed. Gigi pounded on his back as Ken caught his breath. His grandpa grinned. Smooth, right? He pushed the glass back in Ken's hand. Ken drained the glass. What the hell? What else did he have to do tonight but get drunk with his Gigi? His father, his dad, would be pissed. Betty parked in front of the almost home rescue. She stared up at the building, noting that it tilted to the right. Instead of flower gardens like Ken's home, she had weeds bordering the walls. A 6-foot chain-linked fence surrounded the property. A few of the pups watched her, wagging their tails. She managed a weak smile. They at least loved her. It wasn't a wolf pack, yet still a pack. She had known better than to fall for a shifter. What had she been thinking? She snorted. She'd been thinking Ken was hot and her Prince Charming. A total crock of shit, and she'd eaten it with a soup spoon. She managed to drag her body inside the quiet lobby. The animal crates were all lined in neat rows labeled with corresponding animal names. Her parents were so efficient. A note was taped on the counter in large print. They'd gone for supplies for tomorrow, like extra pens and bottled water. Betty sat in one of the many empty chairs, note in hand. A tear splashed on the paper, smudging the ink. Enough tears. She'd been a fool. Not for the first time, and probably not the last. She needed to pull on her big girl panties and make the best of a terrible situation. Once the animals had homes, she'd move. She'd heard Lake City was a nice place to live. There wouldn't be much to pack. She owned very little worth packing. Might as well start now. She wanted to leave ASAP. The longer she stayed in Newport, the longer it would take her to heal. In the next city, she'd embrace her humanity. No dogs. No false pack. She'd only date humans and shun all shifter events. No challenge arena events or shifter restaurants that served appropriate-sized portions. She'd find all the animals' homes, then find herself a new one after. In her apartment, she pulled out a few boxes she still owned from the last move and started in her bedroom, packing memorabilia and books. She'd have to rent a car to travel. Hanging her head, she took a deep breath. Where would she find the money? She couldn't stay in Newport. Just couldn't. Maybe she should return to Riverbend. Until she made enough for the move? Her stomach rolled. That seemed like a worse idea. Chris would hear of her return eventually. She suspected he wouldn't stay away. The thought of another shifter courting her made her dry heave. No. Riverbend. She focused on packing, pushing the things out of her control from her mind. One thing at a time. One day at a time. Breathe. And breathe some more. The sound of footsteps drew Betty out of her stupor. Heart racing, she jumped to her feet and rushed out to the living room. Ken. She stumbled to a halt. Hands clamped over her mouth. The question was out before she knew it. Sorry to disappoint. Trixie finished climbing the stairs. Hey, your parents didn't know you were here. We were just arranging things for the morning. Your dad is ordering pizza for dinner. Betty glanced out the window at the setting sun. She'd lost track of time while packing. Oh. Trixie drew closer, her movements slow as if worried Betty might run. Are you feeling okay? You look pale. She herded Betty to the couch. I'm fine. Even to her own ears, Betty could hear the lies. I haven't eaten since breakfast. Her friend knelt in front of her. I'll get you some juice. Before Trixie could leave, Betty grabbed her by the hand. You're the bestest friend I've ever had. That's nice. She glanced at Betty's hold on her arm. Are you going to let me go now? Betty gave a nervous laugh and released her. I just wanted you to know that. Trixie went to the kitchen and returned with a drink. Down the hatch. Betty emptied the glass. It could have used some rum. There was no point in withholding information from her family and her friends. They needed to know. Trixie, I broke up with Ken today. Why? Guess who's behind my eviction? No, she sat next to Betty. I don't understand. Neither do I, but he lied. She stared into her empty glass. I don't know the details, but the pack is behind the real estate sales in the area. Trixie jumped to her feet and stormed toward the stairs. Where are you going? She had just gotten here and Betty could really use the distraction and a shoulder to lean on. Go get my trank gun. We're going shifter hunting tonight. This time he wakes up somewhere unpleasant. Betty snorted juice. I don't think you'll be able to sneak up on him again. Trixie. She recalled the fight with Chris. And I don't want you taking chances. A pissed-off shifter isn't someone to trifle with, no matter how tempting. Her friend deflated before her eyes. I thought for sure he was the one for you. Me too. Betty set aside her empty glass. I don't understand why he felt he couldn't tell me. Trixie picked up her glass. Got any booze? She shook her head. Sounds like a good idea though. She had a faster metabolism than humans but slower than a shifter's. If she pounded enough shots, she could get buzzed. We're going out then. Trixie clapped her hands together as if a queen making a decree. Get changed. I'm calling in the troops. I can't. I have the fundraiser to prepare for. All taken care of. Your parents are awesome, by the way. Are they up for adoption too? Betty chuckled. They're all mine. I don't like to share, but for you, anything is possible. Chapter 25. Slumped in the passenger seat of Ryota's new vehicle, Ken moaned and clutched his stomach. If you vomit, you're buying me another car. Ken's alpha took a sharp turn, not having any mercy on his rolling gut and spinning head. What were you thinking? Full moonshine dulls the senses. What if someone challenged you tonight? Ken leaned his face against the cold glass of the window. Felt so good. I don't care. Ryota snarled, the sharp noise cutting through Ken's eardrums. I don't, he barked back. At the moment they were not the leaders of New Port Pack but father and son. Ken closed his eyes. What's the point of being beta? Pack is the point. They need you. You're the best beta they can have. Hi. Praise coming from Ryota. A week ago, Ken would have been glowing with joy. His father smacked Ken's thigh sharp and fast like a whip. He jumped and rubbed the spot. Ow! Snap out of it. This time Ken snarled, the sound rivaling the alphas. My soulmate hates me. Fix it then. Ryota took another sharp turn, which sent Ken's head bouncing against the window. He rubbed the spot. Asshole. Ryota grinned. Is that any way to speak to me? Sometimes it's the only way. Ken slurred his words, but the fog clouding his thoughts didn't seem so thick. Will you lift the eviction from the rescue? No, that place is a dump. It's held together by shit and dirt. We're trying to clean that neighborhood. The building goes. Postpone it then. His alpha gave him a hard look. Why does she care about that crap hole? It's not the building. It's the animals it houses. She needs time to find homes for them. Ryota grunted. You like dogs. Adopt them. Ken hung his head. He should have known better than to ask him for help. What is she doing now to find them homes? The alpha asked. She was supposed to bring them all to the orphanage fundraiser tomorrow. I'm not sure if she will now. If she really cares about her pets, then she will. Traffic was thick at this time of the night. They were in the club district and Ryota's car slowed to a crawl. Ken opened his window for fresh air. That's when her scent hit him. He filled his lungs. Betty was close by. He opened the car door while the vehicle was still moving and stumbled out. Granted, Ryota was driving slowly, but Ken fell to his knees and scraped his palms. He didn't feel it. The scent was fresh and he was on the hunt. His alpha's vehicle screeched to a halt. What the fuck? Ryota's voice carried over the club noise. Ken rose and wiped his knees. People paused to stare and point. Someone laughed. He didn't care. Her scent flowed along the breeze and he shoved his way through the crowds, backtracking it to a brick building. The pink neon sign over the door read the Waterhole. Thumping music rebounded off his chest before he even stepped inside. The bouncer at the door was Pack. He eyed Ken, dropped his gaze and stepped aside, letting the beta through without question. On the other side of the threshold, Betty's scent mixed with hundreds of other smells and Ken lost the trail. Lights flashed off the mirrored walls. He blinked to clear his vision. Where was she? Someone bumped into him and he stumbled against the crowded bar. The place was filled with seedy-looking characters. Ken had to protect Betty. Sorry, man. The guy who had walked into Ken pulled him away from the bar and into the crowd. Bodies pressed against him from all sides. The stranger faded away into the throng of people. The place smelled heavily of humans. The occasional scent of vampire trickled among them. It must be a feeding ground. Ken shouldered past the humans easy enough and stood a head above most of them. He scanned the crowd for a raven-haired angel. Nothing. The dance floor looked like a sea of bouncing heads. It made him dizzy. The queasiness in his stomach grew worse. Grandma's dumplings and soup weren't sitting well. A sign for the men's restroom caught his attention and he headed in that direction. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a familiar tattooed arm. Ancient, colorful symbols flowing one into the other. He released a breath he had been subconsciously holding. She'd be safe now. She sat at a table alone. Empty shot glasses lined the table. A group of women blocking his view moved, and he spotted a man sharing her table. He leaned forward to whisper something in her ear. The world went red. He couldn't think. Pain stabbed his fingertips as his claws sprang free. The dude couldn't take a hint. Betty didn't want him to buy her a drink, she didn't want to dance, and she sure as heck didn't want to flirt. The pounding music made it almost impossible to hear anything he tried to say, so he kept leaning against her to speak close to her ear, his gaze wandering toward her breasts each time. How had she allowed Trixie and Ruby to convince her dancing would help distract her heart? It was either go clubbing with them or have her parents hover around her with chocolate and Kleenex. She was done crying and dulling. Her senses had sounded good. Betty didn't care for crowds and was waiting for things to thin out before joining her friends on the dance floor. She'd forgotten about the guys on the prowl, though. She couldn't recall the guy's name, away as he tried to whisper in her ear again, the stink of whiskey heavy on his breath. Go waste your money and time on some other girl. She explained for the third time. I'm not interested. She didn't think she'd ever be interested in men again. Ken had wrecked her for anyone else. Any prospective man had huge boots to fill. The guy leaned toward her again, but a large clawed hand engulfed his face. He was pushed off his stool and away from her table, his arms windmilling as he caught his balance. Ken stood next to her, teeth bared as if ready to shred everyone within reach. He hadn't completely changed shape, but he was seconds from a fur explosion. She jumped to her feet and blocked Ken's path. Whoa, big boy, take it easy. She wasn't going to let him make the worst mistake of his life, no matter what had transpired between them. The growling noises fell from his lips, more like a garble of words mixed with wolf snarls. He pointed a clawed finger at the guy, who made a hasty retreat. Great, another shifter story for the newspapers to print. Ryota would be thrilled about that, she was sure, and probably blame her. She clasped Ken's face in between her hands and forced him to focus on her. What the fuck are you doing here? She spoke slow and loud so he could understand her. He brushed the back of his claws over her cheek. Mine. She closed her eyes for a second and resisted the shifter urge to rip his shirt off and bite him. The mating scent enveloped them. There was no escape. Yes, she was his and he was hers. But he was a jerk and she was pissed. The smell of alcohol muddled Ken's scent and she sniffed his chest. Are you drunk? Not as much as I think you. He straightened and took a deep breath. There weren't many things that could inebriate shifters. Not much of a market for those things either. Alphas kept a tight lid on full moonshine and fairy dust, because drunk or high shifters were dangerous. Case in point stood in front of her. Come on before someone calls the cops. Taking his hand, she pulled him through the crowd. A waitress chased after them. Your bill, she shouted, waving a slip in her hand. I've got this. He pushed her hands away from her purse and reached for his wallet. His eyes went wide as he searched every pocket. It's gone. She rolled her eyes and pulled out the last of her cash. Did someone bump into you when you arrived? The area was notorious for pickpockets. Ken's expensive suit made him an obvious mark. He gave her a blank stare. His skin had a greenish hue. I don't feel well. I bet. She tipped the waitress and took him out the nearest door. It opened out into an alley. The stench of old trash crashed over Betty in a wave of rotten eggs and fish. Ken gagged and rushed toward the wall across the alley, hands pressed to the brick wall. He held himself up as he heaved. She rubbed his back as he emptied his stomach. Took a while. Shifters could eat a lot. He leaned his face against the building and gazed down at her, his cheek squished against the brick. She wiped his chin with the collar of his shirt. My hero. He smiled, crooked and dazed. The door to the alley opened and out stormed Ryota. His eyes narrowed when they landed on her. Figures. Chapter 26. What is that supposed to mean? Betty blocked Ryota's path to Ken. And why? Are you both following me? Was this some weird dominant hunter thing that she didn't understand? Couldn't a girl get some space to think? Mind you, letting her friends convince her to come to a crowded and noisy bar wasn't an ideal spot for pondering either. Ryota lifted an eyebrow and tilted his head. Follow you? I was driving Prince Charming home when he jumped out of my moving car. He pointed to Ken and shook his head in what looked like pity. He must have caught your scent. She ran her hands over Ken looking for injuries. You idiot. Couldn't you wait until he stopped the car? All limbs appeared intact. Ken gave her a crooked smile and looked less wolf-like than a minute ago. You still care? He brushed her hair from her face and leaned unsteadily forward for a kiss. She stopped him with a hand to the chest. You just puked and I'm still angry. Ryota rolled his eyes so far up inside his head, she thought they might get stuck. Come on, Romeo. He slung Ken over his shoulder as if he were still a child. How can you let him drink so much? She followed on his heels. Ken had hurt her, but apparently she'd done just as much damage. That hadn't been her intention. Blame that on my father, Ryota grumbled and kicked a trash can out of his way. No matter what I do, he manages to smuggle full moonshine into the city. I'll text you his number later. Maybe he'll listen to you. She gasped. Ken Birch, you are in so much trouble. Her teeth ached from the force she used to grind them. Of all the things to ingest, that stuff could make a shifter do really stupid things like jump out of moving vehicles. Ryota tossed her an amused glance over his shoulder. He's unconscious. What? She pulled Ken's head back and stared at his slack expression. Shouldn't we take him to the hospital so they can pump his stomach or something? Her heart raced and sweat slicked her hands. She'd never heard of a shifter overdosing, but that didn't mean it wasn't possible. I think he managed the job on his own. The alpha gestured back toward the alley where Ken had vomited. She grimaced. Will he be okay? She ran her fingers through her mate's golden blonde hair. He'll be fine. They reached Ryota's parked car a few blocks away and he folded Ken into the small back seat. Maybe we should roll him on his side so he won't swallow his tongue. That was a thing, right? She tried to maneuver around Ryota to check on Ken's breathing. The alpha stopped every attempt. Betty. He sounded exasperated. I tried to stay out of pack matings, but considering that Ken is my son, I am going to break this rule. He closed the back door and all access to Ken. What are your intentions? She retreated a step and shut her mouth with a painful click. Ryota set his hands on his hips, eyes narrowed and sharp. She didn't know what frightened her more, his being alpha or being Ken's adopted dad. He snapped his fingers. Speak. She jumped. I don't know what you mean. Are you or are you not his soulmate? I am. She clutched her hands and tried to peer around him at her unconscious mate. You should open a window. The alpha growled. Focus, Betty. I'm trying. She barked back. It's kind of hard with Ken sick and you getting in my face. What do you want from me? Of course I'm his soulmate. Do you not see me losing my fucking mind here? Ryota crossed his arms, not budging from the car door. So why break his heart? Today? You told him you never wanted to see him again. Her heart dropped between her ankles and got road rash. She had done exactly what Ryota had accused her of. Are you playing games? Because I won't let you. The pack needs Ken whole. You try to break him, I will do worse to you. He loomed over her. Alpha power. In his glare. It's not like that, she whispered, her mouth drier than a popcorn fart. Then what's the problem? He didn't tell you about handling your eviction? Do you think we'd stop an entire pack project for your falling apart building? Do you think you're so special that he'll put your needs above the pack's? Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to find the right words. The eviction was just the tipping point. No, though deep down inside she suspected Ken would put her needs first. She didn't want him to, which was why she needed room to breathe. They'd been moving at warp speed and she was losing everything in the process, including who she was. I don't fit. Popped out. The heart of her panic. The fury coming off Ryota in waves cooled. He seemed to shrink to normal size, though he hadn't actually changed physically. There's no place for me in Ken's life, no matter how much I want to be part of it. I'm a square peg and no amount of hammering is going to make me fit in the circle. He's smart and professional, I'm a hot mess. I can't be the mate he deserves, especially as the pack's beta. I'm as subtle and diplomatic as a cactus, he finished for her. Betty gazed down at her shoes. Yeah, you don't want me to wreck things for Ken, and neither do I. Ryota leaned against his vehicle, hands searching inside his jacket pocket. He pulled out a checkbook and scribbled something. He handed her the slip with a lot of zeros on it. I don't want this. I know, but you need it. Go home. Take your animals. Move back to Riverbend. Be close to your family. I'm sure Christopher will be very happy to see you. He seemed very determined to have you back. Maybe he can help you shift shape. He gave her the alpha look again. If you choose to leave, don't ever come back. She stared at the check. The amount made her lightheaded. If I don't leave? I'm not responsible for the consequences of your actions, Betty. He buttoned his jacket and gave her a little nod. I'm only an alpha, not a god. Ken woke to the taste of roadkill in his mouth. Blinking his vision clear, he was surprised not to see the barred door of Betty's kennel again. He raised his head and the room spun. Moaning, he clung to the mattress of his childhood bed. He lay on his stomach in his old bedroom. The walls were still decorated with Godzilla movie posters. The vertigo settled. Sitting on the edge of the queen-sized bed, Ken rubbed his aching head. It felt like the monster had sat on his skull. He and Ryota used to stay up late watching the movies together. What was he doing here? He finally recalled sharing a bottle of shifter-strength alcohol with his grandfather. The fact that he was in Ryota's home did not bode well for Ken's day. His father didn't approve of drinking, but the full moonshine had seemed like a good idea at the time. Today, he'd hunt down Betty and ask for her forgiveness. Once he could manage to stand. This was such a small hurdle for them to stumble over. He had a lifetime to make it up to her. He rubbed his temple as memories flashed through the pain. An alley. Vomiting. Betty. He hung his head. Shit. He had chased her down in a club, publicly threatened a human, then puked on his shoes. She had called him her hero, but her tone had said the opposite. He glanced at the clock. Double shit. Ken jumped to his feet. He was late for the orphanage fundraiser without a car. He rushed out of his bedroom to find Benny, his assistant, sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine. He set it aside. The alpha told me to not wake you. Benny, I'm late. How could Ryota do this? He knew how important this day was. For him every year. The orphanage had saved him. They'd found him a pack and, most importantly, convinced Ryota to adopt him instead of giving him to some random shifter couple. He owed them. Ken rushed to the shower knowing he reeked. Benny handed him clothes from home. Ken paused. Do you have a car? The alpha is at the fundraiser in your place until you quote-unquote get your shit together. He closed his eyes. The potential disasters flashed before his eyes. Ryota didn't do fundraisers. He just signed the checks. Do you want me to make some breakfast? Asked Benny. Sure, something to go though. Ken hesitated at the bathroom door. Did Betty call? No, would you like me to phone her? He shook his head. She'd be at the fundraiser. Chapter 27. When Betty arrived at the orphanage, she was taken aback by the majesty of the grounds. The huge stone building, set dead center of a wooded area of at least 10 acres, reminded her of an old English manor. If a horse-drawn carriage pulled up to the building, she wouldn't have blinked. Her ragtag group of family and friends were not the first to arrive at the fundraiser. Food trucks were setting up their venues at one end. She saw games being unloaded and a long truck that read petting zoo. Oh look, Trixie pointed. Ponies. She clapped her hands. Do you think they'll let me pet one? As long as you don't try to ride one, Ruby answered. Where's your spot? Betty? We need to unload and get this truck back before Trixie loses her job. Start emptying the truck while I look. Betty prayed she still had the spot. Ken hadn't been in any shape last night to cancel her table, but he might have done it this morning. I'll go with you. Her mother looked pretty in her yellow jeans and light blue shirt. She was Betty's summer, something she needed right now when all around her was storms. Betty took her hand, suddenly feeling very small, though she was twice her mom's strength. Betty knew she could depend on her mom to stand at her side. Mom gripped her hand and walked alongside her. Dad gave them a wink while doing most of the heavy lifting for her friends. Even after a hard night of dancing, they had all showed up bright and early. They probably hadn't been home yet, looking at Ruby's outfit and smudged makeup. Under a large oak tree, Betty spotted a banner declaring almost home animal rescue. She and her mom stood quietly staring at the large area set in front of the orphanage. A standing chalkboard sign was set on the table with a pile of chalk and pens. The vice around Betty's heart tightened. It had been strangling her since she left Ken in Ryota's care and grew worse every minute. She feared her heart would stop if she didn't find some way to ease the pain. Found it, she whispered. Mom squeezed her hand. You sure you want to spend your day here? Your father and I can handle this alone. I'll be fine. She knew what her mom meant. Ken would be here and she'd have to face him. What Mom didn't know about was Ryota's check in Betty's pocket, and the consequences for not taking his deal. When she left Newport, it would be on her own terms, empty bank account or not. She licked her dry lips. This was one of those moments where she couldn't decide if she should pat herself on the back or kick herself in the ass. Oh look, Angie and Beth are setting up a booth for their back-scratching store. Parlor, Betty corrected on autopilot. Whatever, Miss Smarty Pants. Let's go say hello. Mom gave her a tug. You go ahead. I want to settle the animals so they're calmer when people arrive. And she needed a minute alone to pull her shit together. Goodbyes sucked. No tears today though. She'd cried enough yesterday to last her a lifetime. Any dog or cat adopted was a good thing to be celebrated. They would have found their forever home. Ken would be out of her mind, and then, once the day was done, maybe she'd go buy some of that full moonshine off Ken's grandpa. She snorted. Of all the things Ken could have done, the last she expected was him getting drunk with his grandfather. She retrieved her minions and showed them their spot. Dad happily transported yapping dogs and hissing cats. They didn't like him. Mom still chatted with Beth. Betty caught the occasional glance in her direction. Those two were trouble together. To quote Lord of the Rings, she could feel it in the water, feel it in the earth, and smell it in the air. Dogs on one side, cats on the other, Betty directed. We'll set up a meet and greet pen behind the table where potential adopters can meet the animals. Please, spirits of pets gone by, don't let anyone be bitten. She had no insurance. Betty latched together the accordion-like barrier walls that she would use for the pen. Trixie kissed her cheek. I'll be back, she said in an Austrian accent, then skipped to her work truck, pink hair swinging in the wind. Betty noted her dad slipping the teacup chihuahua in his vest pocket with a cookie. Mom's going to kill you. She motioned her finger across her throat in a slicing gesture. Dead. She knew a lost cause when she saw one, though. Betty had left the Great Danes at the rescue for the same reason. She wouldn't give up her couch potatoes. Who would keep her warm in the winter or clean her floors? Dad stuck out his tongue. I need food. I'll bring you some. I'm not hungry. She'd never imagined saying those words. It had once seemed like an impossible state. Dad pressed his lips together. Disapproval stamped all over his face. You will eat whatever I bring you. Fine. Fine. She waved him off. People were trickling in already. Kids' squeals of laughter traveled from the game area. Some of them wore the orphanage emblem on their t-shirts. Betty leaned her chin on her hand. A shadow blocked her sun. She peered up at the figure and jerked straighter in her seat. Eoin. She cleared the squeak from her voice. What can I do for you? His gaze traveled to the rescues. Are they free? She rose slowly to her feet as to not startle the dragon. Funny how Angie didn't make her gut wrench with fear like he did. Yes. He strode around the table. All her dogs quieted as if someone had pressed their off button. He sniffed at them. They're pets, she added, just in case. Not snacks. She couldn't stop her gasp. The side glance he tossed her way was full of amusement. You're teasing. Please let him be teasing. Of course I am. He moved to the cats. They leaned against the cage doors, purring as if desiring Owen's attention. Cats and dragons? He scratched a few chins and ears. As you know, we have a rat problem at the castle. She nodded. How could she forget? She'd almost been roasted then eaten by their pet vampire in the basement. Angie refuses to return home until I take care of the problem. She's been living with Beth. Ever try to catch a rat? Betty shook her head, trying not to laugh at the image in her head of the black dragon chasing rodents in the castle. They need this much space. He held his fingers half an inch apart. To escape. Do you know how many spaces that small my castle has? Now he shook his head. And I can't get an exterminator to return my calls. No, cheat. She couldn't blame them. Owen exuded threat like Beth did bubblegum. Joy. So you want to adopt a cat? This was a good start. Owen had one of the most Recognizable faces in Newport. People at the fundraiser were already pausing to stare. She just hoped the dragon wouldn't blow flame and scare them all away. I can only have one? He asked. A ginger tabby was reaching out through the bars with its paw, begging Owen's attention. How many do you want? He opened the cage and cradled the cat. Suddenly every pedestrian had a cell phone in their hands taking pictures. All of them. Betty's teeth snapped shut so hard her ears rang. Did you say all of them? He shot her an annoyed look. Are you going to give me a speech about sharing? If Angie couldn't convince me of the stupid concept, I doubt you will. I wouldn't dare expect you to share. Betty pulled out an adoption form and then thought she better not. She knew Owen and where he lived. Normally she would have adoption fees, but she just wanted to find them homes, so today was fee-free. Good. Do you know how to take care of cats? Food, water, shelter. Angie will know the rest. Oh, Betty was sure Angie would be thrilled when she found out. You might want to stop at the pet store on your way home for cat litter and trays. Maybe some cat food in case their rat-catching skills are lacking. He nodded, mesmerized by the purring cat in his arms. I like the noise it's making. It's calming. With a sad sigh, he returned the cat to the cage. I used my truck to transport Angie's back scratching table. I wouldn't let her carry it in dragon form. Can I use the cages to transport them home? The cages are not all mine. I'll return them before your soulmate ceremony. Oh, that small noise spoke volumes. The vice around her heart cracked it. She sat on her chair hard. You can just bring them to the rescue. I only have the place for a few more days though, so don't wait too long. Then I'll bring them to Ken's if I forget. I have trouble with the mortal concept of time. Days, weeks, hours. I'm late a lot. She swallowed the lump in her throat. I'm not moving in with Ken. Owen raised his eyebrow. That's a weird way to be with your one true love. Is this a wolf shifter thing? She stared at her clasped hands, unable to meet his stare. It wasn't a dominance thing. If she moved she might shatter. And she had a small crowd of people forming in front of her table. There's not going to be a soulmating ceremony, Owen. I broke up with Ken. The dragon knelt in front of her and sniffed. You smell heartbroken. Dad arrived. Hey, they have these bacon sausage ham breakfast sandwiches. With cheese. He stared at the dragon. Something I should know, or is this a none of your business dad thing? He set 2 sandwiches next to her and waved at the crowd. Be right with you folks. Smoke drifted from Owen's nostrils. I need a moment alone with Betty. Take care of the table. Before Dad or she could reply, Owen had her by the upper arm and dragged her behind the orphanage. You do realize how rare soulmates are? She struggled. Of course I do. And that any shifter would be lucky to have Ken as their mate? He spun around to pin her with his glare. If you even breathe a word of this to him, I'll eat your dogs. Yes to both. Then explain. I can't shift. That wasn't the only reason, but it was the easiest to explain. The confused look that crossed his face would have been priceless if she wasn't so frightened. You can't shift because of this. He pointed to the tattooed symbol on her upper arm. What do you mean? She covered the image with her hand. It was the prettiest one she had and had cost her a small fortune. What do you know of magic and spells? She shrugged. Not to screw around with them because they're always for a price. She peeked underhand. I had these inked when I was 16. Couldn't shift before this tattoo. It has nothing to do with my shape-changing problem. She almost said dumbass after that phrase, but some survival instinct kicked in to stop her mouth. But he was pissing her off and she was already in a foul mood. Claws popped from Owen's fingertips and dug into the skin of her upper arm. He peeled the tattoo off like a band-aid, but with a lot more blood. Her scream hurt her ears. She clapped her hand over the bleeding wound. Are you insane? He was a dragon, so the answer was yes. The symbol blocks magic. Anything it's written on is wrapped in a shield. You would never change shape with that stamped on your body. He pocketed her skin. You really didn't know? Of course I didn't. She clenched her teeth and resisted the urge to bite him. He shrugged. Try to shift now. She stepped closer and slapped his face so hard her knuckles cracked. You ask permission first before you decide to skin someone alive. Apparently suicide was on her to-do list. He rubbed his cheek. Point taken. How long will you be angry with me? Her mouth opened and closed. She wasn't sure how to answer him. Are you in a hurry? I have a rat issue, remember? He pointed at Angie, who watched them with concern. In his own dragon way, Owen was trying to help Betty and Ken. Not long. Let me eat breakfast and bandage a wound. Can I still have the cats? Yes. You'll try to shift later? She sighed. Fine. Chapter 28. Take the cats in their kennels. I'll retrieve them from your castle soon. The pain in her arm wasn't getting better. It burned with every little move. Good. Owen patted her on the shoulder, making it hurt more. She moaned and stiffened her knees so she wouldn't crumple on the grass. It will heal soon. The smoke stopped drifting from his nostrils. I'll tell Angie the good news. She feels bad not being able to help you. With teeth clenched, she watched Owen's retreating back. She couldn't return to the crowded table looking like a Freddy Krueger victim. She edged closer to the fundraiser and spotted her mother in the meeting pen behind her table. She was helping her dad by letting potential adopters pet some of the dogs. Betty scanned the banners for a first aid symbol. She needed more than the band-aids her mom always carried. The blood seeped between her fingers. As a half-breed, she healed faster than a human yet slower than a full-blooded shifter. Betty peeked under her hand at the thin scab forming. It looked terrible and ragged, but the wound was closing quicker than she had expected. A golden-haired male with sunglasses strode across the bright green lawn in her direction. His intense focus lasered on her position. She'd been preparing her speech to Ken all morning, but at the sight of the beta, she couldn't recall a single word. Would he yell at her right here in front of all these witnesses? Ken's soulmate stood apart from the festival, staring longingly at the almost home rescues table. A crowd had formed and people snapped pictures of Owen carrying away kennels of cats. He stopped the dragon on his way to the truck. You know they're not food, right? Owen snarled and snapped his teeth. Your mate already explained. They are pleasant creatures. His gaze narrowed. Unlike your kind. Then he gave Ken a secretive smile. Except your mate. I like her. She has spirit. He pushed past Ken before he could question him further, knocking his sunglasses off. What did he mean by that? Ken glared in Betty's direction and their eyes met. She shrank away, shoulder drooping and gaze dropping to the ground. It killed him to see her react to him this way. He didn't have much recall of last night, except finding Betty in a bar and then vomiting. Ken's stomach rolled at the memory. Shifter guts were made of iron. He finally agreed with Ryota's policy on full moon shine. It should be banned if it could harm shifters this much. Imagine if a man ingested it. He stormed across the grass, ignoring the stabbing glare of sunlight in his eyes. Head pounding, he loomed over his mate. Betty, he growled as the scent of her blood hit his nose. Look, I'm busy and have to find homes for the animals. Brave words if she hadn't whispered them. Then I'll leave the rescue. She clutched her right biceps, bright red staining her fingers. You're hurt. He gingerly pried her hand loose. The wound appeared as if someone had torn her skin off. Someone's claws. The bleeding has stopped. Who did this to you? Your eyes, Ken. You're wolfing out. Put the sunglasses back on. He bared his teeth at her injury. What do you expect when I find you hurt? Ken scooped her into his arms and carried her to the white first aid tent. Tell me how this happened. She bit her bottom lip. Betty. I tripped. You do realize I can smell lies. She was upset with him about the eviction. But to lie? He didn't understand her motives. He loved her so much. Why couldn't she see this? The tent was empty. It was usually manned by volunteer nurses from Newport. General. He set her on the chair and retrieved disinfectant from the table. Shouldn't we wait for a nurse or a medic? He snorted. I'm beta of the pack. I tend wounds all the time. He glanced up at her. Not just my own. Betty cracked a smile, then struggled for somber. It was like a stray ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. You look like something Trixie pulled out of the gutter drain. She ran her thumb under his eyes. Don't drink that stuff again. It can't be good for you. Yes, ma'am. He shrugged off her touch. It hurt more than his hangover. She took a shuddering breath as he traced the wound on her arm with gauze. The skin would grow back, but not the tattoo. He cleaned the injury of old blood. He could see the claw marks in her flesh. A shifter had hurt his soulmate and she had lied about it. He watched her face. From under his eyelashes. Her brows were drawn down and her lips thin. She didn't shy from his touch. Though. I wanted to. Her eyes went wide. Ryota. Fear tinged her voice. Ken spun on his knee. The alpha should strike fear in his pack's heart, but only if punishment was merited. Respect, trust, and love should be there as well to be a good leader. These were things Ryota had taught him, so why was she so fearful? She rose slowly and pulled a slip of paper out of her pocket, even though the movement obviously hurt her. I'm not leaving Newport. Ryota raised his eyebrows. No matter the consequences? Ken jumped to his feet, snatching the slip from her fingers. What is this? Check. He whistled at the figure. Is this all I'm worth? He crumpled the paper and whipped it at his father. The ball of paper bounced off Ryota's head. You don't understand. The pounding in his head grew worse, but the nausea vanished. Ken clenched his fist as his gaze landed on Betty's wound. You did this. He pointed at her arm, closing the distance to his so-called father who always said he prized him above all others. His little alpha in the making. Ken had him by the throat before either of them blinked. Claws digging into Ryota's skin. Ken shook him. How dare you touch her? Betty gasped. She pulled at his hands, trying to make him release Ryota. Would Ken ever understand his mate? He was protecting her. She said things, but the blood rushing past his ears made him deaf. Why would you send my soulmate away? If he didn't shift, he'd explode in a mass of flesh and teeth. The change took hold, tearing his clothes as he grew in size. Ryota clutched at his hands but remained in human form. Save her, he managed to say past Ken's strangling hold. Save me? Asked Betty, dropping her hold on Ken's hands. Save her. Ken repeated at the same time. He set his father on his feet but kept a hold on his neck. Explain. Ryota took a deep, exaggerated breath. Gave her a choice. She set her hands on her hips. And the consequences if I stayed? Ryota laughed. It was so startling Ken dropped his hands as if stung. He couldn't recall his father making that sound often. Ryota bent forward, leaning on his knees, laughing even harder. Then he pointed at Ken. He's your consequence. He wiped his eyes. That felt good. You gave up a fortune and remained in the city. He gave Betty a sad look. You can't possibly think you can break up with your soulmate. Ryota patted his shoulder. And Ken clicked his muzzle shut. Go get her, son. Then the alpha straightened his polo shirt, the wounds on his neck already healed, and strode out of the tent. Keep it PG. There are kids out here, he said over his shoulders as the tent flapped shut. Betty picked up the paper ball and uncrumpled the check. We should cash this and donate it to the orphanage. Ken loved the way she thought. Ken snorted and hugged her tight against his chest. For hurting you. She cleared her throat. About that. Owen tore the tattoo off my arm. Not Ryota. The world froze. I'm going to kill him. That's suicide. Betty blocked Ken's exit from the first aid tent and explained Owen's crazy reasoning for maiming her. She caressed Ken's wolf-like face and drew it closer to hers. I'm sorry. He blinked. For what? I was the jerk. I'm the one who is sorry. I shouldn't have blown. I should have told you. They interrupted each other. Then silence filled the tent. Ken was willing to fight his alpha for her. No amount of money, freedom, or promises would make her leave his side. She ran her fingers through his fur and recalled the day they met. How his eyes had gone from feral fury to wide wonder when he'd first seen her. Something had clicked inside her. She hadn't been ready to admit it then, but boy was she ever ready now. Betty jerked from his hold as a sharp pain ran along her spine, cracking all her joints. Gasping, she clutched his shoulders. She held her hand in front of her face. Claws grew from under her nail beds. Ken. Panic laced her voice. Your eyes. He supported her by the elbows, eyes growing big. You're changing shape. She couldn't breathe, the pain was so blinding. Ken laid her on the ground. The dragon was actually right? He stroked her fur. She raised her head, staring at the black silken fur coating her body. Joints popped, limbs and face elongated. On unsteady legs, she climbed to her feet and compared herself to Ken. I'm still short. He threw back his head and howled. Chapter 29. Betty flexed her clawed hand. watching in fascination as it followed her. Command. It was her. She had shifted. Ken paced around the tent, checking her out from every angle. I can't believe. The dragon was right, he whispered. Yeah. She glanced at her arm where the tattoo had blocked her magic. There was a patch of missing fur now. Why would someone stop me from shifting? I'm a nobody. She'd gotten the skin art just after she'd started dating Chris. A soft growl pulled her out of her thoughts. Ken stared at her healing wound. As well. What was the artist's name? I'll find them and we'll find out. She rubbed the raw area. The pain a distant ache now. The shop closed when I was still in high school and, she grimaced. I'm the one who picked out the design. Could it have been so silly that all this had been an accident? She had a book that I flipped through. I liked the way it flowed and thought it looked cool. She pressed her hands to her face, ears pinned to the top of her head. Chest burning, she whined, since in this form she couldn't shed tears. I did this to myself. Slowly she sank to her knees. She had blamed her pack and her family for her failure to change shape. Not once had it occurred to her that she was the one at fault. Betty. Ken knelt with her, pulling her hands free. You're packed now. He rubbed his muzzle against hers. She sighed and leaned against him. That means I'm the beta's mate. Her shoulders shook under the weight of all that responsibility. I don't know if I can do it. Do what? Be a part of your life. Fit in. I've never been good at fitting in. What are you talking about? His eyes narrowed. Don't try that breaking up shit with me again. Not unless you really don't love me. She stroked the hurt from his face. Took a few minutes before the lines faded. What am I supposed to do as your mate? I'm not well educated or even have a resume. His ears came forward. I expect you to open another animal shelter in the same neighborhood if you want. Mind you, there will be construction starting, so you might want to reconsider relocation for a year or two. She ran her hand over her muzzle. You're serious? He tilted his head in a very canine manner. What did you think I'd want? She shrugged, so happy the fur covered her full body blush. Nothing. Betty. Amusement coating her name. You broke up with me over nothing? Ugh, when you put it that way. She shook her furry head. Host meetings and business parties. She shrugged. Rub elbows with prominent business people. He snorted. The only elbows you're rubbing are mine. He licked her forehead. You don't have to be part of my business life. I've handled that alone for a long time. I don't want you to change. I need you to be you. Person who shows me how to have fun and teases me with crazy friends and gets into fist fights with dragons. He licked her face, soothing her worries away. The tent entrance flapped open and her dad barreled in. Betty. He stood, stunned in the streaming sunlight. Mouth open, he stepped inside the tent. For once they stood eye to eye. So she had grown taller as a shifter. I changed shape, Dad. How? He stroked her fur. It's a long story. We'll tell you and Mom over dinner tonight with a alpha. She glanced at Ken, who nodded. Ryota was part of her family now. Oh wow. Dad still petted her face, a tear forming in the corner of his eye. He rubbed it away before it escaped. The little teacup chihuahua popped its adorable head out of Dad's vest pocket and yapped. Dad, put Princess Buttercup back so she can be adopted. Princess Buttercup? Do you hear that protective bark? She's demon dog. Hellraiser. He eyed them. Everything fixed between the two of you? Do I need to use my dad voice? Ken hung his arm over her shoulder. Everything is perfect, but I hope one day soon you can show me how to use the dad voice. She leaned against Ken, enjoying the wonder in her father's face as Ken's meaning sank in. Grandpups. Not yet, but soon if they worked hard at it. Come on. He gestured for them to follow. We have to show your mom. She glanced at Ken, knowing Ryota had strict rules about public displays of their wolfish form. It's fine, Ken said. This is a pack-funded event. We just don't want any public shape changing. They stepped outside of the first aid tent. The orphanage property was full. The air rang with laughter, scents of greasy meat and the colors of summer. What now? She asked as people turned in their direction. Ken grabbed an empty donation jug by the tent and set it by their feet. Come. Pet the wolf shifters. People started to form a line. He shrugged. I'm good at making money. I can't ignore an opportunity. A few hours later, Ken stood beside Ryota, eating the burgers he had provided. Betty sat in the grass surrounded by pack kids, both human and shifter. Her fur mane and head were decorated with paper flowers that she was teaching them how to fold. Their donation jug was almost full again. He would need to find another replacement soon. Many humans had wanted a close meeting with a wolf shifter in beast form. Ryota towed the jug. This was good PR for the pack. That was as close to a compliment as the alpha could manage. Ken would take it. Ryota eyed Ken's mate. She shifted well. Ken growled. She's taken. But his father was right. No matter what shape. Betty's beauty stole his breath away. Midnight black fur coated her body. Sunlight poured over her, glossing the hairs until it appeared a liquid. The amber of her eyes shone golden and pure. He let out a breath. The knot in his chest constricting his lungs since he'd first told Ryota about her finally vanished. She shifted. The alpha patted Ken on the back. She's safe and she's yours. Good job, son. Ken gave him a side eye. What if she had cashed the check and left? I would have killed you for chasing her off. Ryota shrugged. Then you would be alpha. The smile on his face was very wolf-like. But she didn't, and now you know she's truly yours, heart and soul. I knew that the moment I met her. I didn't need that kind of test. As far as he knew, his father never had a mate. Definitely not a soulmate like him and Betty, but a regular mate, someone to love. I needed it. Ryota handed him another burger, while eating his own. Betty rose to her feet gingerly, still adjusting to balancing on her hind paws. The crowds were thinning and some vendors were closing shop. Her parents waited on the other side. Ken waved them over. You're about to meet her parents and my future in-laws. Behave or I'll bite you. Ryota chuckled and Ken ignored its hint of evil. They gathered his mate and met her parents. Ken handed out burgers and glanced at the full tray Ryota had brought. He had made some food trucks day. Mr. and Mrs. Newman, meet my father Ryota, Alpha of Newport Pack. He bit his tongue trying to eat and pay close attention to their polite exchange. Would be great if they could be friends, would be stretching it. As Alpha, Ryota couldn't help being dominant, but he could be amicable. Mom and Dad managed to find homes for all the animals. Betty spoke between bites of her second burger. They're amazing. She gave her mother a side hug. Her mother didn't seem to notice though. She was busy staring at Chuck's vest. What is moving in your pocket? Betty's father covered it with one hand. Nothing. Betty's eyes sparkled with amusement. She tilted her head in a gesture for Ken to move aside with her. Is that a chihuahua? Her mom's voice rose. Charles Newman, what did we discuss about more canines in the house? It's so small, I doubt it is canine. Ryota leaned forward to peek at the little goblin-looking dog. Let's go home, Betty whispered to Ken. This is about to get ugly. He slipped his hand into hers. You read my mind. As they slid behind the first aid tent, he could hear Betty's mother's voice. Join the others. Where did they go? We still need to plan the soulmating ceremony. Chapter 30. The full moon hung above the grove, lighting the group of shifters and humans. Betty peeked out of the tent. Still no sign of Ken. Her heart pounded. Come away from there, Betty. Dad hovered behind her. He did his best to hide his worry, but he wasn't good at acting. He pulled her away from the tent flap. Gently. You look beautiful. You already told me that. She swept her hand over the long soulmating gown that clung to her curves. She'd chosen a white one as a nod toward her human heritage. Though the pack now considered her a shifter, Betty was still half human and proud of it. Her mother sat at the front of the crowd, a little chihuahua in a tutu on her lap. I'll say it again. Her father twirled her around. You look beautiful. Betty had chosen her own gown, but she had left the details of the ceremony in Beth and Mom's capable hands. With all the animal adoptions to complete and a move to Ken's home, she hadn't the time to invest in such a short notice ceremony. Everyone was anxious for the formality of their soulmating to happen sooner rather than later. The hum of the crowd outside quieted. Betty rushed back to the tent flap, her father hot on her heels. Outside, Ryota stood on a raised platform. As the Newport Alpha, he had the right to perform the ritual. Ken stood at the base, eyes focused on her tent. His tux fit him to perfection and moonlight shone on his golden blonde hair. He Looked so classy, but she knew the shifter in him wasn't far from the surface. Ready? Asked her dad. Yes. She slipped her arm around his and waited for their cue. Betty. She twisted to meet her father's gaze. Yes. I'm so proud of you. No matter what the universe tossed at you, you took it on with Newman's style. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Of course I did. I had the best teacher. She'd been so lucky to have such loving and supportive parents. In coming years, she and Ken could only hope to be as good with their pups. The music started and they both startled. It's time. Dad straightened his bow tie. She'd never seen her father in a tux. He was more of a grease and jeans kind of guy. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Yes. Finally, she and Ken would be bonded together officially in the eyes of the pack. With her father in tow, she stepped out of the tent, eager to reach her mate. The crowd turned as one and she halted mid-step. Seemed like every shifter in the city from wolf to bear to feline was in attendance. She couldn't see the edge of the grove, it was so full of people. Your story touched the hearts of many, her father whispered in her ear. I bet every half-shifter in driving range is here to witness this moment. You give them hope. A tear spilled down her cheek. She knew firsthand how those who couldn't shift felt lost and alone, packless. Many of them adjusted to human life very well, embracing their heritage, but others like her struggled. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. How could she voice all those emotions without falling apart? Ken took a step toward her as if sensing her distress. Betty gave him a reassuring smile. She was living the dream and wouldn't take a single moment for granted ever. Dad wiped her cheek clean before leading her down the aisle and toward her bright future. He placed her hand within Ken's. I pass on the responsibility to protect my only daughter to you. The pack beta kissed her fingers. It's a privilege that I eagerly accept. Ryota joined them, placing his hand on Betty's shoulder. I pass on the responsibility to guard my son's heart and the pack's future. For a second, Betty couldn't breathe. It's a privilege that I eagerly accept. Her voice shook. The alpha returned to the stage and addressed the crowd. Soulmates are a rare gift. We're led to believe that it's an instant bond and an easy path to happiness, but I have never seen two people fight for the right to be together as these two. They showed us that to achieve what we want, we need to be ready to fight for it, to sacrifice everything to be with the one we love. I have never been more proud or pleased to perform this ceremony as I am tonight. Under the moonlight, the alpha spoke the sacred words of a shifter soulmating, something passed on from pack to pack spanning centuries. Ken's gaze never left hers. In his eyes were unspoken promises. In her heart were hers. Welcome to the Newport pack, Betty Birch, Ken whispered. I love you so much. She stepped closer until they were nose to nose. I love you more. She rose on tiptoe and kissed him,